about what I call the global technology race and the position of individual countries in the global technology race. I will also talk about the framework of the different sources of growth and development, which help, I think, relate bits and pieces of what we may be familiar with, like education, like investment, like knowledge flows, into a broader perspective. And then, the second half of the lecture will be specifically more on technology and how policy can increase absorptive capacity. If time is sufficient, I might spend a few words discussing this new concept, or fairly new concept, of middle income trap and what can be done to escape it. That's because I definitely think this will apply to some of the economies in the area. We'll continue exactly where we left off, the role of education in the innovation system. While the previous lecture was from the perspective of an institution trying to achieve these goals, I will take a macroscopic view, coming from a comparative view of education in many different parts of the world, and then trying to zoom in on the same questions. I will not continue on the debate that we had. I thought that was a very useful one about the different potential goals of university research, but I will try to provide a sort of comparative perspective from much of the same issues. I will also, at the end of the lecture, try to engage in a debate on the role of brain drain and brain circulation, which I think is one of the big topics in the region. I do not feel that I know enough about the specifics, so I would like to really have this in a two-way fashion. I'll give my, again, international perspective and see what lessons we can learn from experiences in other parts of the world, and you, I'm quite sure, can fill me in on the details, so that way we can have a joint production. Some background literature. I am working on the revision of a textbook on development, where there's a long chapter on education, which is not yet published, but you have a draft, I hope, which contains much of the detail of this presentation. There is a very beautiful review article by two education, I think, economists, Andershek and Busman, about the role of educational quality, which anyone interested in the field, if you haven't read it, it's really a fantastic overview article. Then you have an older publication of the World Bank on Constructing Knowledge Societies, and a quite recent research paper about how important it is, and I think that was so well highlighted in the previous discussion, where the constraints were so clearly visible that governments are not willing to fund sufficiently higher education research, and I will make the case that they should be doing it, and that there are international comparisons which show, give you kind of guidelines of how much you should be investing in higher education. So we might be trying to tackle that funding constraint from an international perspective. Please, again, as in the previous presentation, interrupt me whenever you feel like it. This is a brief outline of what I'd like to do today. I'd like to start with a brief discussion about education, which is so specific in being both an end and a means of development. It's an input into various other things, but it's also one of the value goals of all societies to develop education as something which is important in itself. I will have something to say about the changing international context of education. If you are patient enough to bear with me, I would like to say something about indicators. Depending on your interest, we can go slowly or rapidly through this. But, then I would like to approach it from the perspective of human capital theory and what that says about the role of education in economic development. And the second half, even though it's only bullets 5 and 6, but it should take a substantial amount of our time, I'd like to focus in the main problems in educational systems in general, and I think most of them are also applicable to the region, and then look at the debate about the various alternatives and policy priorities and that things. Okay, the first thing that I'd like to emphasize is that education has many different functions, and usually the discussion zooms in on often too much only on the economic dimension. I will also be doing that, but just to defend myself against too narrow focus, I'd like to briefly discuss with you all the different functions. First of all, education is a goal in itself and a means not of achieving other goals, but of developing yourself. All of us who have been through educational systems know that is also an important part of education. Personal development, emancipation, broadening your view, not only in order to have a better career or something else, but as something which is interesting in itself. There's also the contribution of education to civil society and general attitudes in society. That is one of the educational functions of the whole education system. There is a very interesting debate about the role of education in inequality, and there are two perspectives. From one perspective, education has always been the key upward route to mobility. In societies, getting educated is a way where people from very different backgrounds can show social mobility. Extremely important function. But there's also an opposed view of education, which sees it as a system of privilege, where people from certain, usually privileged backgrounds, have access to best education, and so it serves also as a mechanism for reproducing social inequalities. And I think both of these functions actually exist. It is true that people from privileged backgrounds usually have disproportionate access to good educational institutions, thereby reproducing inequality from generation to generation. But we've also seen, especially in certain periods, that the expansion of education has been a huge opportunity for social mobility. So that, I think, is an important aspect of education. Then, and I don't know how important this function has been in this region, but in many parts of the world, education has had a political function of developing of something like a national consciousness of nation building, development of citizenship. This doesn't always work, because sometimes it backfires, and you get, for instance, in countries like Indonesia and India, where education was very deliberately used as an instrument of national consciousness. The backfiring is that you get all sorts of regional movements which went to emphasize their differences rather than their national sharedness. So again, there's a debate about this function of education and how well it functions, but in the role of education in the wider process of development, it has definitely played a role. For instance, in China, even today, it is definitely part of the maintenance and consciousness of national nationhood, which is very much emphasized in the educational system. Economics, and that's where we will be focusing most, as in the previous lecture. The education system is a system of human capital formation. It should contribute to improving employment and income opportunities. And what we have been realizing in recent years, and that is not completely new, but a little bit new, is that education should be seen as part of the national innovation system. In the older educational discussion, it was all about human capital. which is a sort of a linear approach. You simply want to improve the supply of human capital in society and economy. Now, as in the previous presentation, we are focusing on the linkages between the education system and society and economy, and not just on creating an increased supply of good graduates, though that is not unimportant. I think that is the new element in the education discussion. Then, very much in relation to the previous lectures, the education system has a role in generating new knowledge. This is the somewhat more fundamental aspect of university research that I was focusing on, and I think that is at least part of the picture, if not all, but not necessarily all of it. And I think the education system also has to do with is building the capacity to tap into global knowledge flows that we were discussing in the morning. So, in that sense, it is a continuation of the previous presentation. What is interesting, I think, about education is how closely it is connected with all sorts of other goals of, well, economic and social development. We know that, for instance, improved female education is hugely important in child health and in reduced mortality, child mortality. Also in the development of fertility. So education interacts with all sorts of other aspects of socio-economic development in a very complex fashion, and it is often the key to achieving social outcomes. I once more can't resist putting this complicated figure on the screen because it sort of helps me, again, put education within this wider framework. You can see education as an input in the economic system, where it actually focuses on the labor input, improving the quality of the labor input. That is, labor quality is very much part of the economic production function. But it is also itself one of the outcomes of the development process. Having a good education system is seen as one aspect of development which is desirable in itself. And also, as I said, you can see it, education interacts hugely with health, with fertility, with child mortality. So there's also all sorts of interactions between education and other aspects of social development. And education will also feed back into long run. I mean, the fact that huge numbers of society are going through the education system itself in the long run means that has an influence on attitudes, on mentalities in wider society. So, and again, we will primarily be discussing this part. I wanted to put it in a broader framework. Now, something about the changing international context of education, which is hugely important for this region. First of all, I think we should emphasize the rise of knowledge-based economies. Innovation and technological change is not restricted to a small number of high-tech sectors. But by now, there's no aspect of the economy, also the so-called traditional industries, such as garments or textiles or shoe production, all of these, or agriculture, are subject to accelerating technological change. That is the context, not only of education, but of the discussion of innovation. There's also the specific importance of knowledge-based industries for economic growth. For instance, we know that in East Asian economies, ICT sectors has played a specific role in this growth acceleration that we see. I'm not saying it always has to be ICT. In different contexts, it can be different things, but knowledge-based industries are important for growth. knowledge has become a source of competitive advantage, developing new products which are not available elsewhere, perhaps more important than only cost competitiveness. Well, in that sense, again, we are living in a global knowledge economy. Then, I'm belaboring the obvious, looking at this room where sort of everyone seems to be connected online at the moment, in spite of all the warnings to the contrary. I just had the same in the workshop last week. The ICT revolution creates tremendous new opportunities. It creates the need for ICT skills, but it also creates new threats. I'll come back to that. But the simple fact that the whole discussion of Carlo about global value chains would not be possible without an ICT revolution. The revolution in communication, in transport, has been so radical that it creates new opportunities for this region in particular. A less far-ranging but also important point is that it creates new opportunities for educational innovation. Again, given the nature of the Caribbean, distance learning should be and is a huge potential for reaching all sorts of isolated populations in new manners. And also in terms of the content of education, there are all sorts of things, interesting things going on. Most important of my international context is the emergence of the global labor market, where the problems facing this region are not unique to this region, but are facing very many countries in the world. Graduates are now aware that there's a global labor market, and they're looking at it. So the chances of people moving from one place to another are tremendously increased, which, again, contributes in economies with insufficient opportunities to an outflow of capabilities, which threatens exactly what you're trying to achieve through education, namely the building up of social capacity. So this is one of the most dramatic challenges facing the education system, how to deal with it. And I want to, at the end of this presentation, try to debate with you. I have some suggestions, and you must have ideas, but I think this is one of the most important challenges facing. And there have been countries which have come up with rather satisfactory solutions. So there is something to be learned here. There is the counterpart of this global labor market is that in the so-called advanced economies, there are increasing shortages of skilled personnel. Think of the US. I think about 50% of all PhDs and postdocs in the US are of Asian origin. So if at some stage they decide to leave, the USA is finished. It's huge, but as long as the opportunities are so superior to elsewhere, they continue to profit from this huge income. Huge. And the same is true, for instance, in my country, the Netherlands. I mean, the number of PhD students from the globe is exponentially increasing. The willingness of domestic populations for some reason to pursue a research career is diminishing. So the pull factor is enormous. And if you have a good education system and there's a strong pull factor, you have a huge problem. And I think I see some nodding heads that you are aware of this problem. Then, again, in relation to the previous lecture, there is a renewed interest in tertiary or higher education. To simplify, as I like to do, you could say that the educational advice for the past 35 years is focus on primary education. The returns to higher education are higher than to primary education, are higher than investing in tertiary education. So there has been a shift worldwide of resources to primary education. And now we're suddenly finding out that in the knowledge economy, higher education plays such a crucial role that we may need to rebalance. So we do not need to take given financial constraints as never changing. I think we need to tackle those and discuss whether we are doing the right thing. You see how the presentations actually fit together here. Here you see a slide with a summary of some of the threats and opportunities. You have the increasing role of knowledge, which has the opportunities such as the possibilities of leapfrogging, the resolution of social problems, and accelerated growth. I think we discussed that earlier in the morning. But you have the danger of increasing knowledge gaps if you cannot keep up and if you cannot develop sufficient absorptive capacity. You have the ICT revolution, which provides much easier access to global knowledge and information, but which also has the danger of a digital divide. If you cannot keep up in human skills, but also keep up in infrastructure. We should not have limited broadband in the university. We should have access. Same goes for my own university. I mean, but you need to invest heavily in keeping up. That's why it's a threat. Please don't misunderstand me. I don't want to criticize. I just want to say that given the increasing importance, it creates also challenges for investment. Okay, and we already mentioned the global labor market, which has some tremendous advantages of much easier access to knowledge and expertise, but the threat of brain drain and loss of human capital. Okay, now, again, I like to look at these issues from a measurement perspective, and I have here a number of the most important educational indicators of educational performance. The most widely available indicator is the gross enrollment ratio, which is defined as the number of enrolled persons in a given school level as percentage of the population in the relevant age bracket. So, to make this more specific, if you take the 6 to 11-year-olds, you know how many you have in a country, and then you say how many people are enrolled in primary school as percentage. This is a very close indicator, because you don't actually know whether the people in primary school are of the right age. And we all know friends of ours who are much too old, should have been out of school long ago, but still are there. So that's how you get gross ratios, which are well above 100%. Because all the people who are too slow are also counted. There's a lot of other problems with the gross enrollment ratio, because it's usually too high. Because we have a vested interest as educators in inflating the number of our students. The most scandalous example was a Dutch polytechnic, which had hundreds and hundreds of students who didn't exist, because you're financed by the number of students. So they had a lot of dead souls, which they put on the books and got more money. So if we want to report on this workshop, we will say, well, there were, look at it, I would say there were about 60 people. We won't count you exactly. And we all do this kind of thing, consciously or unconsciously. Nevertheless, I'm going to start with the numbers, because they're so widely used. And one of the shortcomings is exactly this. It says nothing. It's all about input. It says nothing about quality. It doesn't even tell you if people have finished. You can be in school for 6 years and not be able to read and write. It happens. I even know people, it must be very clever to do that, but okay. So there's an upward inflation. It doesn't tell you what the rates of completion are, and it tells you nothing about the content of education, which was your point. One attempt to improve the figures is to use the net employment ratio, which is the percentage of an age group enrolled somewhere in the schooling system. So if you have 12 to 17-year-olds, what percentage of your 12 to 17-year-olds is somewhere in school? Okay? That's useful to know, but you don't know where they are. And the new definition is actually a better one. It says, how many of the 12 to 17-year-olds are actually enrolled in what we define as secondary education? That will, and that I think, that is, so the new indicator is better than the old one, but if I want to look at long-run trends, it's difficult. And actually I have the impression that UNESCO, who collects these statistics, has sort of given up on net enrollment ratios. They are getting more difficult to find. One step closer to what you are interested in is to actually look at how many people have completed a given level of education. It doesn't tell you anything about quality, but it tells you more about just being there. A very important indicator in economics is the amount of human capital. How many years of a certain kind of education do you have? Well, we actually don't know. So instead of having the years of education per worker, we take the years of education per member of the population. That we do have, and we have a famous data set which you can download at the click of one mouse click, which is the famous Barrow-Lee data set, which provides data for 160 countries from 1950 to 2010. So that's very nice. You can get it while I'm speaking. Okay. Then you have all sorts of interesting indicators, such as how much is being spent per pupil. Well, usually expenditures per pupil in higher education are much, much higher than in primary education, but it differs from country to country. I think a useful indicator, again related to the previous lecture, is expenditures for different types of education as percentage of GDP. So what, on average, the norm is that a country should be spending around 4 to 5% of its GDP on public spending on education should be in the range of 4 to 5% of GDP. I haven't checked whether that is the case. I haven't had time to look up those statistics. That is the kind of norm internationally. And then we'll discuss norms of how much of that should be spent on higher education. So you have a kind of an international benchmark which you might use to convince your ministry that they might need to do something else. Then we start moving to quality. And one of the most important indicators of quality is literacy. And I was quite shocked to see that the region, at least if you use internationally available statistics, as some countries have very high rates, or comparatively high rates of illiteracy, up to 10-12%. That's, for countries, relatively high. Though you can do a lot worse. In India, has very high rates of illiteracy, which is unexpected given its achievements in other educational areas. Then we have the famous Program for International Student Assessment, and that is really, I think, the way forward, where you rank students for their cognitive skills in reading and writing, arithmetic, and what is it else? And at this moment, I think it was started by the OECD for European countries, but has now expanded to some 65 countries, including several Latin American countries. Can anyone tell me whether the region regional countries are involved in PISA? I haven't seen the statistics, so probably not yet. But it is one of the moves towards testing education. Pardon? What?
No, I just said Trinidad. There was a report on Trinidad.
Okay.
We have a report on that.
So this is a movement from inputs and percentages to trying to grasp the quality of your educated people. I'll skip the last bullet. Speaking in general, worldwide, developing countries and emerging economies have had, in quantitative terms, spectacular performance in improving education. The expansion of educational systems since the 1950s is really unbelievable. In many countries which started with very little, you have well-established educational systems, whatever their shortcomings. And I think if you look at it historically, this is a huge positive achievement. There are a number of buts, that you still have large gaps between best practice and emerging economies. Another very important gap is that you can have substantial investment in education without economic development. This, for instance, is most striking in Africa. If you look at where most African countries come from, in the colonial period, with almost nothing, building up primary, secondary, and university education systems, that's a huge achievement. And it happened between 1960 and 2000. At some time, people believed that education was the golden bullet, and if we do that, then growth will come automatically. It didn't happen. So we're learning that just increasing the supply of educated people will not do the job. It needs to interact in various ways with other aspects of the economy, with physical capital accumulation, with access to knowledge, together with these other things. It's extremely important, but just taken as a single factor, well, we talked about simple solutions. If there's one factor in development, whether it's absorptive capacity or physical capital accumulation, people always think there's one thing, and if you do that one thing, it will happen. And what we're finding out is something about the systemic nature of development, that things have to interact. Education was one of those hopes which was not realized. And one of the dangers is that people were so disappointed that now some people, like William Easterly, argue that education doesn't matter. And that's hugely stupid. Sorry for exaggerating again.
Before you go on,
Yes.
it's kind of like interesting, or not interesting or puzzling that you left off like speaking about the last part of the indicators, which is non-formal education. I think that is an important indicator, non-formal education, because what I'm saying is innovation and entrepreneurship normally come from what I'm saying is, or entrepreneurs or innovators normally come from the non-formal education.
That's a very fair point, and why did I develop it? Partly because I don't have good statistics, and when I can't measure it, I forget about it. But it's not a good point. It's not a good argument. I think non-formal education outside the regular schooling system has become increasingly important, and I should have discussed it. This both involves on-the-job training in firms, but also all sorts of campaigns, all sorts of nature. And I think it's actually hugely important and becoming more important over time. That's why it was on the slide. I don't even know why I skipped it, because I should have included it. And actually, in terms of educational innovation, that is where most of the action is. And that's the point you wanted to make. Thank you. Then, once more, coming back to this problem of quantity and quality, we have succeeded quantitatively, hugely, worldwide, increasing the supply of educated people at all levels, but we know too little about the quality of what we're doing. And this complaint that the gentleman on the left was making, that employers are saying, we have all these graduates and they can't do anything. I've heard that in 15 different countries. I remember, for instance, in the state of Kerala, which is famous for its high level, in India, the paradise state, which has very high levels of human capital, with high levels of life expectancy. They have everything except entrepreneurship. But those entrepreneurs that are there say, we're producing all these ICT graduates and we can't use them. We have to get them from elsewhere. And that story comes again and again, and it's not restricted to this region. So it's something. There seems to be a problem. Okay,
but cost as well, because at the end of the day, this film is really all about making profits and bottom line.
Did you hear the question on the other side? The question of whether it was just quality or cost. I think it was quality. At least what I heard from the debates was that we want to hire somebody, we have a vacancy, and of course you'll take the cheapest that you can get, and if you get the same quality cheaper, they will do that. But the main complaint was that they were simply not up to the job. That they were not trained in the right ways, or that the linkages between the kind of training you get in the university and the kind of qualities you need in practice may also be incorrect. So my answer would be more quality than cost. Well, I think cost is also a factor. Yes?
Just on that note about the quality of the education of people coming out of the universities here, I wonder if there isn't maybe, I don't know, like not a deference, but maybe more of a willingness to accept a graduate from somewhere outside rather than, and consider them more qualified than somebody who's been by the region. I mean, I think sometimes we tend to look at outside and think they have more of the solutions, they know more of the answers, and trust them more than we trust ourselves.
Yeah?
I think that's a good argument and certainly applies to some things, but I think in terms of the point that Nirad was making particularly, we do have, especially with recent graduates who have not yet had time to accumulate experience, we are having that problem with respect to the quality of the graduate. For example, I was at a session where the CEO of BP said a few years ago, when they looking for new recruits, there was a higher percentage of graduates out of the University of the West Indies that they were bringing into the system. That has diminished over time. In fact, now they are not, it's a very rare number that comes from that graduate. And University of the West Indies, in terms of engineering, that's one of our premier faculty. And we have had that diminution in terms of the quality. And they're now looking for the graduates that come from abroad. So it is a real problem with the quality of the graduates. Maybe over time after they acquire experience, might be a different story. So that's one thing. I think in terms of what point Debbie was making, I think it's two things. If you're in the US and you have a vacancy and you have a choice between hiring an American, we have to pay 3 times the price for the same quality that you're going to pay an Indian or somebody from the, obviously, the cost factor becomes more important. But if you are, again, in our case, a developing country, and you have the choice between a local who you're probably going to get for cheaper than you're getting for somebody that's foreign, you may not have a choice but to pay the extra and get that skill because it's a skill that you need, because the local person, the local graduate is not coming with the quality that you want. that in terms of my interface with the private sector is what they are arguing.
I would like to respond to your point. I think you have a point. So it makes me think what I'm doing here. Because there is a mentality, again, in many countries, to consider what comes out from outside as better. And so if people are asking me, what should we do? I don't know. And I was shocked in Africa that there's so many skilled graduates who are not being employed while they bring in super paid consultants from outside at 3 times the cost without necessarily having the local expertise. And what they forget is the learning aspect. You may employ somebody with less international experience, but if you don't employ them, you will not develop the skills and the learning. So I think it's also a mindset. To give up the idea that what comes from outside is necessarily always better. I mean, I do believe having a mix is important, and getting outside knowledge in is important. But I like your point, and I think it's partly that there should be a conscious policy to try to employ people that are being trained and give them the learning experiences that they need. So I very much like that point. I would even make it part of a policy priority to try to do that consciously. You have Mike?
Yes, thank you. I know we are focusing on the quality of the graduates from the University of West Indies and their inability to satisfy the needs of the private sector. But I'm looking at another dimension. I wonder if there isn't a component of the relevance of the education system as well, and not just the quality, but how relevant it is. And it's because of this poor link between the academic and the private sector that we are not really getting the type of education that is needed in the private sector. So it's also a question of relevance, and it might not be a question of quality. I'm not sure. Yes.
Let me respond to those two, because you're saying basically the same thing. When I talk about quality, on the one hand I'm thinking of cognitive skills and knowledge and abilities, but I'm also thinking of relevance. And what you're both saying is that we need to rethink the relevance of what we're teaching, because not every university student is going to go on to be an academic researcher. And that's the built-in bias of higher education. They won't want to create that. And most of them will go out and do something much more practical. So in various ways, and you're already saying what I will end up with, we have to think of, for instance, incorporating entrepreneurship training, which you may have already done, which is not easy, by the way. And building up linkages and practical training in the course of study, so that you don't see an enterprise the first time you leave university, but have already been in and out, especially in fields like engineering. So if you talk about quality, on the one hand, it will be these cognitive skills that are measured by PISA, but I think it's very fair to say that also the nature of the curriculum should be part of the story. So I do think we need to find a balance between the kind of academic things you teach in higher education and the orientation towards the private sector, and finding that balance is not always easy. So I think we're in English. Okay. We can continue later. Then let's skip this, but what you see is huge increases across the globe in the gross enrollment ratios. Here's a slightly simplified version where you see that enrollment ratios in all regions have shown upward trends. From 1960 to 2010, let's say developing countries, 1960, 2.1% was highly educated. Now the average is 21%. So what more do you need for really a tremendous change? I had a look at the figures for the region. I couldn't get long-term serious. But here you have some figures on primary, tertiary, and secondary and tertiary education in 16 countries between 2000 and 2009. What about Barbados? The 72%, which comes from well-developed indicators. That sounds very high. Is that possible? Yes? 72% is having higher education. So that's the exception to the... Because if you compare it with, let's say, Trinidad, it has 12%. Higher education, gross enrollment ratios.
Also a priority of government. The principal of the Cable campus has also said he wants one graduate per household as well. So it is very comfortable. Okay.
So what you see here is very interesting differences between regions, but on the whole, I think they're very high figures. So it's obviously in terms of effort, a huge effort is to increase enrollment rates. Most countries in gross terms have over 100%. In net terms, it will be lower. Secondly, enrollment rates are also extremely high. So this, in comparative perspective, is a very high priority to at least the quantity of education.
And that is a challenge. Quantity as opposed to relevance.
Yes.
And I don't want to say quality, but relevance.
I think we agree on that. Yes?
The quality issue is, someone pointed out the curriculum and so on, it's so multidimensional. So you have this situation in Barbados and Trinidad where everybody has access to tertiary education, right? You guys have that here, right? But there's a big problem, there's a huge problem that comes along with that. There is tremendous pressure on teachers to skew the bell curve, at the very least. If not, skew it in the wrong direction. And I speak from both first-hand and anecdotal material, having taught and spoken to people who teach. And so that impacts quality. Because you have everyone coming into school who, and whether we like it or not, and there's some things that we don't want to say because we want to be politically correct, but there's some people who are in tertiary level institutions who really should not be in tertiary level institutions because they have not had the grounding from the secondary school in academic tertiary level institutions I'm talking about, as opposed to transitional or vocational tertiary level institutions. And there is tremendous pressure to pass these students through so that you do not damage the reputation of the institution for having too many failing students. And that has a ripple effect. It's happening to UE at the very top, and it's happening all the way down. And again, I'm only speaking from first-hand experience, as well as some anecdotal evidence, but I'm not speaking of third-hand at all.
You're giving a pulse.
Very good point, because as he said, nobody wants you to say it. Nobody wants you to hear it. Nobody wants to hear it. It's a truth that nobody wants to hear.
I know that also for example, in Antigua, I think our statistics prove that 75% of the students that come out of high school level, they're more, they've been already more or less branded for technical and vocational. Very few actually, quote unquote, should go on to the A level and then the college, university degree and everything, which is very interesting. But having said that, though, I mean, I think we also have very limited, not I think, I know, because I was unable to even source information on the higher education because we don't have policy and plan and all of that, and statistical data to support that. And also, and then also, I guess to Nurad's point, there's also kind of a thing in the region, I guess, where, we have a mindset in terms of what it means to be educated. And so you find that there's a interest or there's a push maybe for some in specific fields. Or, people are trying to fit into areas where they're kind of misfits in those areas. And right now I know CARICOM is going through their qualifications framework to look at the competencies that would determine which level a person should be at or what's required to take you to that next level. It's very interesting, the whole discussion about the higher education and also the quality of education, competencies.
I find this a very interesting discussion because the things that you hear across the world in different countries seem to be so similar. What I want to argue is that education is a so-called necessary condition. It will not produce economic development in itself, but to put it again in my exaggerated way, I do not know of a single case of economic success which was not preceded by investment and improvement of the education system. If you can mention any country that has done a job without investing in education, then I will speak up. I don't know of any examples. This is what confuses the statisticians. So if you do econometric exercises with these enrollment ratios, you're not going to find much. And that's why Easterly and Pritchett concluded that education doesn't matter. That is what econometricians do, sometimes. If you look at the historical evidence, education works with huge lags. It can take up to 30, 40 years before educational investment pays off. And you need to have so-called complementary factors, such as investment in technology and investment in capital. The famous example was Japan, which was already highly educated long before it was economically developed. And then when it started investing, the combination of a human capital base and the existing skills led to this rapid explosive growth. All the East Asian economies had invested in education, high levels of literacy, long before their economic takeoff. Scandinavia was dirt poor in the 19th century, but they invested in education because you had to read the scriptures. And that was the motivation for education there, highly literate, and then you see that they become among the most religious nations. So I think the historical case for education, in spite of everything that we're saying, remains strong. Now, if I have 5 minutes, I'm going to jump. That is the 20 slides in between. But this is the important message, and I thought the debate was more important than going through all the slides, which I will now skip. And I want to go to the policy debate quickly, if I have this. Here you have a slide with a set of challenges. First of all, financial. We've heard the complaints of inadequate resources, and the discrepancy between requirements and resources is increasing. There's an unmet demand for especially higher education. There's the quality problem. There is, as many of you have noted, the huge problem of lack of relevance, mismatch between education and the labor market, insufficient role for on-the-job training, as again was mentioned by you, that a too academic, not practical enough direction of higher education, and insufficient attention for technical and vocational, especially middle-level vocational technical training. So these are, then I would also emphasize the huge issue of brain drain. Coming to the, well, these are some general figures on brain drain, and I've also, which are almost worldwide. The only country which is the exception was Thailand, where no one goes to go. That's an interesting cultural phenomenon, which we learned when we did a workshop in Thailand. But in the Caribbean context, the rates of net immigration and the migration stocks are among the highest in the world. Over the past 55 years, more than 5 million people have immigrated, more than 1/7 of the total population. Correct me if the figures are completely off, I don't think so. On average, 12% of the labor force has immigrated, especially skilled migration, a mass exodus of professionals, especially in health and education. 50% loss of the labor force in tertiary education, and there are, and this is counter-side, high rates of remittances, but economic assessments of the net effects are that there's a net negative welfare effect of skilled migration. So this is the challenge which I think you are all very much aware of. If we then move to the various alternatives and policy priorities, first and foremost, try to focus most on the quality and relevance of education, both while measuring cognitive skills. That's a check on this pressure to reduce. I mean, if we are giving away degrees and some external measurement shows that people don't have the competences, this creates a shock wave, and that can help us improve and maintain standards. Especially important is teacher training and teacher motivation. It is probably the highest factor explaining cognitive skills of pupils, according to this paper by Hanushek and Woosman. Teacher qualifications. I think we need to improve the research quality at higher education, better pay and facilities, measurement of outcomes rather than enrollment, having non-bureaucratic quality assurance systems. I would like to emphasize the word non-bureaucratic, because those of you who are teaching know that there's a lot of bureaucratic assessment going on which has very little to do with the content.